Hi, I'm Caleb Ward. I am a postdoc in philosophy at the University of Hamburg and at the Free University of Berlin. I'm really excited to be talking to Schwarzrund today, who is going to be a part of this interview series on Audre Lorde's thought and sort of philosophical legacy. The interview series is funded by the Center for Gender and Diversity at the University of Hamburg. Well, it's actually a cross-university initiative in Hamburg. And so I'm very thankful for that support. So Schwarzrund is an Afro-Dominican German activist, educator, writer, novelist, poet, performer. And they are soon defending a dissertation on Audre Lorde's political philosophy at the University of Erfurt. And I believe that the dissertation has an approach that comes out of history, also Kulturwissenschaft, gender studies, bringing together a lot of different sort of influences on Lorde's thought, and also, if I understand correctly, like really tracing the legacy of her work.
Yeah, so I studied first gender studies and culture and art studies. There's a very specific German term for it, which is Kulturwissenschaften, and it doesn't translate well. And then I did my master in gender studies, but gender studies at the Humboldt University is very transdisciplinary. So it doesn't say a lot to say I study gender studies, because that's like a bucket that can mean anything.
Right.
So for me, I did one semester at Freie Universität at the Latin American Institute, which is very political sciencey border studies stuff. And I did some philosophy stuff on the soil, gender, eco connections,
great.
which was also very helpful. Then my bachelor was on music and musicology. My master was a very history heavy negotiation of race in República Dominicana. So I moved between the fields. I did stuff in biology and journalism. That's everywhere.
Which is, that's very fitting actually to grasp the kind of wider impact and influences in Lorde's work too.
Yeah.
Before we move forward though, I just want to acknowledge that your poetry book, Es hat sich auserklärt, which for English speakers
doesn't translate at all.
The literal translation is it has become clear, but do you want to say how you would translate the title? Well, the point is that it's coming out this week, so it's very exciting.
So erklärt in German means explained. It has been explained. And I actually created a German word, which you could do in German all the time, which is one of the benefits in German. And auserklärt would be it has been so much explained that there's no explanation left over, or there's no explanation left in me, or so es hat sich auserklärt is this had been explained to the fullest, or I explained enough, and I'm done with it. So however you want to read it.
Yeah.
So it's a creation of word, Wortschöpfung, as we say in German. It's also heavily referencing Audre Lorde, because she so beautifully put it that we always have to create the pen again if we want to address issues, and that we lose a lot of time on that. And if we look into Nash, Jennifer Nash, we also have the same idea of where can Black studies lead, if we always have to start with Black people are actually people, and it takes up space in books, and books can only be so long, and it's when you do a talk, you always have to start at the gravel, while when you do theory on white people, you don't have to do that.
Right.
When you want to address, for example, Kant, you don't have to say Kant was a white man, but he was still a human.
Right.
Let's talk about 3 theories why Kant has been a human. And 4 reasons why Kant was actually important. We always have to start at the beginning. So for me, they kind of merged together quite beautifully, because I think having this poetry script in my bag and editing it while writing my PhD and negotiating this topic helped me to really narrow down in my PhD what do I want to say, what needs to be said, and what can I add to the scientific discourse. Academic discourse, because in English you have this a separation of access at university. And hopefully I have not too many unnecessary explanations in my book. And
I mean in the dissertation?
In the dissertation, because I kind of had this other picture project screaming at me like, es hat sich auserklärt, it has been explained. There have been so much great writing on Audre Lorde, I don't want to just repeat what has been there.
Yeah.
So my approach is actually looking at her as a political philosopher or philosophic political person, however you want to phrase it.
Yeah.
And I try to draw down the lines of how she came to her theories. So just as a broad overview, just so you have an idea, because I couldn't look into it till now.
Yeah.
The first chapter is called Differences, which is the shortest one. And I try to understand how the terminology of difference can be found in her correspondence, in her letters. I worked with the Spelman Archive, with the June Jordan papers, and so on. And how difference came into Audre Lorde's life and how she filled it with meaning. Then from that I go to the terminology coalition versus solidarity. And this is like my border studies chapters, where I first go into Grenada, her home island, and how she experienced through the invasion her being different in blackness than other black people in the US. Then we go into South America, where she learned from Ellen Cuswayo, who was a South African amazing feminist women rights activist, and how she learned from her actually, and how she grew through their correspondence and negotiations. And the final chapter is maybe what everyone expected to be the whole book, which is the German-European chapter, which I had to fight for not to be pushed too much into that line.
Right.
And I actually there try to break with the spell of Audre being the one person who gave that one impulse, and instead I try to trace earlier lines of Black German activism.
Great.
Before her, and then try to also look into her speeches and talks, where she always tried to get away from this rule of there have been no black voice, but then there came this US voice, and then they will be able to speak. And she was no, they were speaking, you weren't listening. Why are you listening to me? And the final chapter is less historical, less philosophical, where actually it's called Futurism, and I go into her progressions, which she called them. So the uses of the erotics, poetry on luxury, and then Cancer Journal's A Burst of Light, and letters concerning that. And I first talked with Petra Costa, an amazing musician, academic, activist from Brazil. And Petra works a lot with their body and with the erotics, and has written the amazing Southern Butthole Manifest. And this conversation really helped me to understand how to navigate the erotic in a activist and also analytical political sense. So part of the interview is in my dissertation, and then
that's great.
It's I hope to release one day the whole interview, because it was really, really eye-opening for me. And then in the chapter on poetry on luxury, I actually wrote a theatre script that is a discussion between Audre Lorde, Phyllis Wheatley, early black poet in the US, Karl Marx. Virginia Woolf has a little
cameo.
She's giving us her room of her own, where the play is happening. Missy Elliott is there. Then a fictionalized nowadays black academic, and Frantz Fanon is there, and also Amiri Baraka, who had this amazing beef in the 70s and 80s with Phyllis Wheatley, who was already dead then. So they have that beef in real time.
Wow.
So I try to negotiate all these different ideas, from black nationalism to black Marxism to Stuart Hall is also there, these different approaches of black futurism, and they have a colloquium on Audre Lorde's text, and they discuss it in that room. And then the final chapter is on the cancer journals. And I try to create, based on all what I did before, an idea of black ribfulness or queer blackfulness, because Lorde used this amazing term of blackfulness, and how that can be a political strategy to approach absolutely different issues. And then I hope the book ends there.
It sounds so incredibly rich. It really sounds wonderful. I can't wait to read it. Wow. Yeah, and to be doing that at the same time as writing your poetry book, your first published volume, I guess. You've been performing poetry for a long time. I mean, do you feel so, for Lorde to identify herself as a poet first in a lot of ways in terms of her work, poet, teacher, and maybe we'll talk about both the poet side and the teacher side. But did you feel like that freed you in some sense in the more sort of scholarly early chapters of the dissertation because you had this poetic sort of outlet that was always being valued next to it? Or like, how did you feel that your engagement with Audre Lorde as a poet enabled your kind of poet practice?
That's an interesting question. I never felt like one needs to fuel the other or they are taking away from each other. But through my whole academic career, that always has been the question, like, why are you doing so much at the same time? For me, I never first choose the form and then choose the content. I always look at the content and find the right form for it.
Yes.
So I started in 2015 actually to write on Audre Lorde. And I tried it through essays, and I love them. Like, their essays I'm very proud of. And I write through poetry. And then I understood more and more through learning on social contract theory and learning through ideas of difference in how to structure policy from the state layer. I understood that I need the academic form. For me, the academic form is not lower or higher than any other expression. For me, it's just one form of expression that follows specific rules. And I think it's also very artificial boundary. So I always love to refer my name patron Anna Kauna. She has been she's called a princess, but she was actually the queen. So she was leading the Taino people before colonization in my home country. And she became the leader of 4 splitted nations because she was such a great natural poet. So her poet skills qualified her more than her bloodline. And that's how she became the queen of them. And why the other kings said okay, we're kings, we're men, but whatever, you're great at poetry. And that's how she became the leader, because through poetry she was able to negotiate this very, very troubling times of colonization. They didn't have a blueprint. They were one of the first islands to get colonized. And through poetry she was able to think through those new things. And when we look into poetry as a luxury, that's exactly what Lorde is describing.
Right.
It's not was Lorde first a poet or first a political thinker? Her political theory is why her poetry is so rich. And her poetry is the reason why her political theory texts are so well to read and well structured. Do you know what I mean?
I definitely do. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and that, it's related to this sort of idea of those political theory texts as progressions. They're prose, and which has certain, is fixed in certain ways, but they're always going somewhere, and they're open-ended. Every paragraph almost is open-ended in just incredible ways. Yeah. On the kind of other side of that is the teaching side. Yeah. And I wonder, I think that you're drawing on some of Lorde's archive, especially on Germany, on the recordings of her seminars at the Free University 40 years ago this month.
That's true. Yeah.
And I was curious to hear how you see her teaching work as, because she says survival is the ability to move and to teach in one of her seminars. What do you see as, what do you think she means by that? And how is that part of her political vision?
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, especially maybe in the European context where teaching is often split in time from learning. So maybe that's the first differentiation I find super important when we look at figures from the 80s from a non-German context. Because here usually you go to school and you have learned something and you never will learn that again. So there's no setup where you go back to math 8th grade or something like that. You build on that knowledge. You build on it and learn new stuff, or you teach that stuff. Those are kind of the 2 lanes. But I think the way Audre structured her life, teaching happened at the same time as learning. So I see her more as she transported her knowledge. She learned from the correspondence and interactions with different activists from absolutely different fields. For example, Joy Harjo, an indigenous activist, they wrote hilarious letters to each other. I
Oh,
don't
wow.
know so much. One of my favorite findings in the archive. And she used what she learned from Joy to teach them. And what she taught brought her lections from her students that she then brought back to the activists. So I see her more like in a web of knowledge. So that's maybe that part. And I think the moving comes in with it at the same time. She moved a lot, like moved inside of her city. She moved through countries. Even when she wasn't moving anymore in a physical sense, the sheer amount of correspondence she had that were not like, just like, hey, how are you doing? I'm great, bye. It was really like, hey, today we had this conference in this little German city and we had this discussion, and it really remembered me of that other discussion we had. She was very involved in the very, very like super local discussions. So for me, moving is not only like the ableist idea of sitting in a plane and moving, it's also moving through thoughts, moving through movements at the very same time. So I think that's why her texts are so universal, why I would argue that she is a political philosopher, because she was not just, and I don't mean that to belittle other, an activist in one field that negotiated one or two differences. She tried to look at as many differences as possible and try to learn from this to build up her theory of, as I would argue, difference, coalition, and futurism.
What you just said really made me think of the last paragraph of Poetry is Not a Luxury, where she says, there's no new ideas, there's only new ways of making them felt. And then she says, in the particular, at 3 a.m, when you're lying awake in bed, I mean, she doesn't quite say that, but, making love, waking up in the morning, having coffee. And so she goes down to the hyper-local particularity, which is exactly what you're bringing out of her letters, because that's sort of, well, now I guess this is the question. Is that for her the scale of change at that kind of the level of where feeling happens in the particular? Or is it just kind of, what do you think this sort of starting point of change in Lord's thought is?
I think what helped me the most was like 2 little words I found. It's like 2 little phrases, I would say. The incomplete vision and the black fullness. That's for me like kind of the like motors.
Yeah.
What is need for change. And before I start with the black fullness, which is still very vague to me even after thinking about it a lot, and I really look forward to discuss it on panels, because I'm like, there's something in there, let's talk about it. But with the incomplete vision, I feel very, very secure to talk about it. So it comes up in different texts, sometimes as that phrase, sometimes phrased differently. She was using it to criticize the civil rights movements and white lesbian, very singular structured cultures and family approaches and so on. But what she basically means by that is, if we have a vision for the future that is not really shaped by reality, we come to a vision, but it's incomplete. And then we build our activism, policy, theory, art, whatever line you're in a wrong direction. We feel like it's right, but it's actually not right because our vision is incomplete. And how she, for example, addresses this is with this text Man-Child, where she talks about this festival that is only open for women, and she really wants to go there with her wife, but her son is too old, and they have an age limit on non-cis woman bodies. And then she thinks about it. What does it mean? How do we shape the future if we keep them out so early? If we only see a vision for non-cis woman bodies that can produce violence, if we don't if we don't approach them differently, how can they even find visions for themselves that are different? And I found that so rich. On the other hand, in one interview, she said, and I really struggled with that if she would ever hear that her son did violence to a woman, she would kill him, which is on the completely other side of it. But I think that's maybe helping to understand this micro and macro level that you were addressing. I think in the very interpersonal space, it's very, very hard to keep the broader vision in mind. Hence why she kind of pleas for movements to build a very, very strong, very complete vision, so that when we have to make choices in our personal lives, we kind of can address something bigger. And for me, that's kind of the same, like a Christian belief or any other belief is like a higher system of values that we then can use for very like super different situations. So for me, here, like Christian belief or whatever belief you want to approach, it's almost the same as a scientific set of belief or like a theoretical kind of belief. It's always a rule book you put yourself under to then know what to do. So yeah, I think for me that is like one phrase I find super helpful to understand her text, that she's very looking for where do we argue the wrong way and lead towards an incomplete vision. And that's why she's criticizing, that's why she's pinpointing, that's why she's such a pain in the ass, because she really wants us to, hey, this is too easy, this solution is too easy. It sounds great, way too easy.
Yeah.
And for me, the black fullness in that is a way more like theoretical or ethereal feeling of kind of a gut trust. So for me as a black person, sometimes I have that gut feeling of, yeah, this sounds great as an idea, but something is off with that. And that she kind of tries to shape this black fullness as a like decolonial, anti-colonial, kind of compass to negotiate this finding process. So that we, for me, the way I fill with meaning her blackfulness in my dissertation is that blackfulness stands in for everything she was able to address in her lifetime, but also all the issues that came later. Because, for example, the trans communities are really leaning on her texts when we now look into like neurodivergent texts and theoretical ideas from autism people and whatever. They also lean heavily on Audre Lorde. Yeah. If we look into asexual theory, they lean on Audre Lorde, not because she was able in her lifetime to address them, but her political philosophy is broad enough to do that. And I find in that blackfulness, because blackfulness always has to like learn to approach new differences inside of blackness while still struggling for equality. We don't have the luxury to be too separated for too long, because when we look at Black Lives Matter, it has been trans women and non-binary folks who were leading the movement. So the mainstream discourse needed to shift rather quickly. So yeah, maybe those are two like core concepts.
Yeah, that's really, thank you so much. That's really brilliant. I guess a follow-up question about this sort of, so I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the way that she talks about in her poems about sort of the generational sort of shift and the inheritance of certain tools that might be useful for, for tools that were honed or created in a previous season, and maybe the seasons have changed and some of them are useful, some of them are no longer useful. And then the question is, how do you teach in a way that the next generation can tell the difference and figure out what is useful? So I've been teaching Audre Lorde, and the students often have a kind of suspicion about the way that she talks about the erotic and the deeply female plane and everything that's about being deeply female or deeply women. People are a little bit uncomfortable with because of this sort of implication of essentialism. How do you see, well, I guess on the one, first, I'm interested to hear your analysis of that kind of moment in her thought, but I'm also interested to hear how people in the sort of trans activist community that you've seen using her thought kind of negotiate that, and whether people are just feel free, as maybe she would want them to take what works and leave what doesn't work.
Yeah, there was this one interview actually on her where she actually answered exactly that. There was a wide interview. I can't remember the interview right now because I read bazillions of them, but they were like kind of fear-mongering towards her. We're like, what is if your texts don't work in the future? And she was like, I hope they don't work in the future. That would absolutely be terrible, because I want to start something here. I want to be part of a longer discourse, and if you look back on me on 40 years and say, that's the best we got, I would be super sad, and she would have missed her goal. So that's why I think she is a thinker, because that's how the search for answers works, that we always find new answers. and she didn't saw herself as a like priest or anything in that, and that's also why my last chapter, like my conclusio, is called "Praise the Lord?" ? Because I actually think this like glorification doesn't help her or her legacy.
Yes.
So maybe that is a like very first broad answer. I always struggle with this "what does trans community think?" questions,
Right.
because I think it differs a lot from where you stand inside of trans and non-binary discourses, or if you even identify with the Western concept of transness. So, or if you have other concepts about it. So that's a very broad, very gender studiesy answer to that.
I think that's the no
Yeah.
visions answer. So
Yeah, I think I have
right.
to give that first, but I think there is a lot to use from her, and when we look on a like biographical level, she had gender struggles from very starting point of her life, but we also have to remember that she was born in 1934, so the access points to be trans have been drastically different than today,
Right.
and the ways to survive as a trans person. And also this line between cis, trans, and inter are very, very, very much temporarily. They change through time, who we see as what in those three categories. And yeah, that's maybe also how to negotiate the archive in that, because she lived for quite a long time. So where she was as a born child is totally different than the time when she died, when we look at the trans discourses that were happening. So what I would say is, when we look at Kiguru Macharia, they are also using Fanon, even though Fanon wrote homophobic stuff.
Right.
But still there's a lot in Fanon to address gender issues. And for me, Audre Lorde stands at the same point, but she also had experiences with like non-conformity to gender. So, and I think this is also rich as a like witness of her time. She wrote that the only way to be a good gay girl, which was a term they used back then, is to be femme. And then you could blend in and you could exist in your gayness as long as you didn't talk about it, but was okay. And she never identified with femme, but she also never identified with butchness either. So I think that's already very interesting, that she didn't find a mold inside of those categories. And I mean, when we look at pictures of Audre Lorde versus Pat Parker, we see Pat Parker as so much more butchy in the way she dressed. But I think in the way Audre Lorde behaved in interviews, and also how she talked about women that she was attracted to, like it was very like butch energy. So gender is not just one thing. For me, it's a very like relational term. How do you relate to others? Which is like a very non-gender studies answer, because no one agrees with me on that. But that's a very like Caribbean way to look at it, and I think that's helpful for me, because she was Caribbean in her upbringing. She was Caribbean in her like closest first relationships to people of gender. I would call them like cis people. So her negotiation of gender reads very close to home for me. Or also how my dad addresses gender, my Dominican dad, and how like a lot of elders in the trans community from the Caribbean addresses gender. So I think if we talk about Audre Lorde, TERF versus trans, it's already the wrong discourse. She was a part of her time, so she didn't address TERFness sometimes in books of other writers, but maybe also because she was busy addressing the racism in that book, the Mary Darley discourse. Audre Lorde, trans ? I think that's also putting a lot of like projection into her, because even if she still wouldn't have the same experience that trans people today.
Right.
So I get the hope and longing and desire for that. So I think for me the discussion is more between white and non-white communities in trans discourses. And there I can get like very direct. I try to work with a white trans writer. And what he tried to make is the argument that Audre Lorde has to be a TERF, because she didn't address the very heavy TERFness in Mary Darley's book. But I'm not so sure about that. I think that's too easy, too simple. And sometimes, even at her time when she was alive, people really tried to push her into discourses she was not familiar with. there is at the beginning of A Burst of Light this very awkward interview. I don't know if you read it.
The sadomasochism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where they're like, what is your take on SM? And she was like, I don't know. Like, and then she was really pushed into like, have a stand on it. Like, now tell us what is the moral about like. And when I read that as a kinky person myself, as a kinky academic, I'm like, it was just not her thing. She didn't totally get like it's fine. Like, don't like she doesn't have to be like the voice of truthness in every discourse that could be broadly summarized under the umbrella of queer. So I find that not a very like helpful approach towards her, towards any thinker or poet or whatever. Like it's okay to have your speciality, and why do that to people? It's weird.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have a little bit of a different reading of that interview because in a way she does give out this kind of principled view about hierarchy and how hierarchy, as what, a distorted mode of relating can, and then we integrate it into all aspects of our life. But I think the core of that, her core point is what she says, I think more or less at the end, she says, but who benefits from us like criticizing lesbians about the ways that they are inventing relationships in their bedrooms or anywhere else? Like, why is it that we're so focused on this question, when we're actually being ground down to dust by forces that are outside of the community?
But I think I agree with you. I think it's the same take we have on that because she is asked so much, and I think it's so interesting that it's printed down in that detail, that she at one point starts to use her principles to answer that question instead of the way she does it in other interviews where she always starts on the micro level. She's like, this is my family, this is my son's experience, this is a very like particular discourse we are having, and this is a moral I'm taking from that. Or you can take any other example. This is this one book fair, there happened this one ableist event, and this is what I take. Like she's always starting on the like event level and then builds up theory from that. And here she is like asked to do the other thing, which is very not her way to negotiate knowledge. Hence why I think why she at the end wasn't like her super butchy theoretical, and this is how it is. She was more like, what does it bring to anything now? Because she doesn't have the experience. And I think that doesn't mean she can't have an opinion on it, but I think that's the difference between building theory and having an opinion on it. And sometimes this gets mixed up in texts about Audre Lorde, how to approach her material, because it is so rich. We don't just have like peer-reviewed journal entries of her. We have bits and nuggets everywhere.
Yeah, as she wanted it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I really love that contrast actually between this kind of particular outward approach, which I think is totally right. I mean, that I feel that strongly in the cancer journals, for example. I was thinking about also when you were talking about the way that she negotiates gender roles. I'm thinking about the Cancer Journal. I mean, the Cancer Journal is such an incredible text, and I'm really happy to hear that you have a chapter in your dissertation on it. I'm sure that it will have a life beyond the private document when the dissertation becomes a book. I can't wait to read it. Because it's this struggle, right, over what a woman's body is for, or what a kind of femme body is for. Yeah. And it really does exactly what you're talking about. So of working up from the particular situation. So I'm curious.
Can I address one situation because I'm a little bit obsessed with it right now?
Yeah, please.
Okay, cool. So there's a situation with the Reach for Recovery about the question of like after losing a breast, how to negotiate that loss. What is the right way to do that? And one suggestion that is brought to her is to first take into like a little like pillowy thing that is beige, not matching her skin color, and then later get a prosthesis. It's very hard to say to me in English. And the reasons brought up are it will look normative, it will feel normative for your partner, it will create less irritation, and my absolutely favorite hate argument by a doctor is it will motivate other cancer patients, which is most confusing part for me. Brilliantly addressed by Christiane Hudson, actually, in the Mehrdimensionale Verletzbarkeiten text. Sorry for the English audience. This won't be helpful for you because it's a German text, but it's amazing. And I really sit on that scene because of another project I'm doing right now, which is on the Krüppel-Zeitung, so the 1980s disability rights movement in Germany. And they had a magazine called Krüppel-Zeitung, so Krüpp magazine would be an English translation. And they have been Krüpp woman groups, actually. They wrote it together as a gender term, Krüpp woman, not separated.
Okay.
And they criticized Anzeiger, how you say that in English, announcement for a new walking stick, which has the brilliant name Der Senator, the senator, but in the male term in German. And it says it will bring her elegance and safetiness again. And she's leaning on this like very head man in her very femme dress with her strongly male connoted like walking stick. And I try to compare this in this project, Lord's reading of like where's the line between an access tool, a dysfunctional access tool, a tool that will make you look more like having an abled body. There's this beautiful term from the Krüpp woman movement that is called Konfektionskörper, which is absolutely untranslatable, but it's like a body matching the system for clothes, kind of.
Wow. Yeah.
And so I would say Lord here describes absolutely what a Konfektionskörper does. A bad job for access tools, because of course when you're a model it can be super helpful to have that pillow, because that's the function of your body. You make money with looking a certain way in a bikini. But as she addresses, she wants to have sex with other people with breasts, and she's scared about not having two breasts matching each other. And this problem is not solved by this tool at all.
Right.
And she also addresses that maybe it feels the same if you have a partner who doesn't have breasts themselves. But if they have or ever had breasts, they will feel the difference, and also you won't feel the touch. And one level more that she doesn't address directly, but kind of like implicit in the text, is you even feel less than if you wouldn't wear the prosthesis, because else you would at least feel the touch of the skin. Maybe not like the nerve endings of the nipple, which are distinctly different than just skin, but at least you would feel the touch of the skin. And there comes in for me trans body theory, because when we talk about transness and body integrity, you can use a prosthesis for sex or just for moving through the world or whatever, and you can start to have feelings in that prosthesis because your brain starts to make the connection. It works the same way. When you lose a leg, you have like a phantom pain. It works the same way around. Your brain can start to connect those feelings. They're like handy notes on that if everyone wants to look up. And I think that's a very interesting question. Actually, you learn later through this way to enjoy sex again in your body because you don't have that new sensation, and your brain deeply needs to make that connection again. This feels different now, but it's still pleasure. Maybe different pleasure. But through this like reach of recovery approach, the focus is more on the pleasure of the world than the pleasure of the body.
Yes. Yeah, and the woman's body is supposed to play the function of pleasing the world and not pleasing herself.
I would agree on the like pleasure of the outworld, but I would go one step further, especially in the history of the US with the ugly doors. I don't know how familiar you are with them.
I don't know.
It's terrible. It has been laws implicated on, I think in the 18th centuries are the first recordings. They were very local. And they basically forbid disabled bodies to leave the house. They were called ugly laws, and they have different constitutions that I don't want to go too deep in it, but basically its structure is still today how disabled bodies, non-normative bodies, are negotiated concerning public. So I find it so interesting that when she is in the hospital, she's easy to locate. She gets this thing on her body to look as normal as possible. She can't even leave the hospital without being pressed into that form. So when she enters later this doctor's office without it, it feels like breaking a law to everyone there, because it has probably been breaking laws in the past. So maybe this feels very like Vergangenheit, like in the past, but the Frankfurter Urteil, which happened, I think, in the late 70s or early 80s in Germany, has been the same. There was a woman complaining about a group of disabled travelers at her hotel, and she got pain money. Like, how do you say that in English?
Yeah. She was compensated for her pain, for her, suffering. Yeah.
Of eating breakfast with disabled people in the same room.
Wow.
Because she shouldn't be forced to see that in her holidays. So, as I said, I told you it will make you angry.
Yeah.
So I find this historical context very important to reading this scene, because what she's experiencing is, as a person who didn't negotiate disability before that, even though she was disabled, very connected to the disability communities, she was like just overwhelmed by that. Like, this doesn't make sense. Like, what are you doing? Like, why is this like? And this is beige. I think that's her confusion with like a very real experience disabled bobbies have all the time, and that is not just someone being rude or someone not getting you, or it's like the consequences of a very, very old theory of eugenics, that disabled bodies shouldn't be there, or at least shouldn't be seen there. And I think here comes in the political theory part that she's building on. It also makes us invisible to each other.
Right.
So we can't fight for our rights if we literally can't recognize each other. And this like non-recognition is something that I think that is sometimes not talked about now when we talk about IP, identity politics, and we like see this like yes or no question. No, it's about recognizing each other and then understanding that this is structural. It's a very, very easy layer. So when you say, oh, why everyone needs to have an identity right now, the question is like, why do you take away so many rights from people? Else there wouldn't be a need for that.
Mm.
So I think that's very interesting, this like demarkification of the body as disabled.
Yeah, I mean, I would love for you to, this is amazing what you're saying, because you're taking what she is doing in the cancer journals and you're really deepening it and adding something to it, like zooming out further than she was able to zoom out in her moment. And I really appreciate that. I'm interested in coming to difference as a sort of political principle, because I think that this sort of very concrete function of difference as something that needs to be somehow seen in order for people to recognize each other and build, and I would say identify their political interests and vulnerabilities. I mean, that's, I think, very clear. And, also with her work with the Black German students that she's working with, and then wider movement. But I'm curious, or I'm not curious, but I would like to hear more about difference beyond the visible. What is difference as a sort of engine of political change and action for Lorde?
Yeah, I think it's like a layered question. I think the first thing we can learn from Audre Lorde is that differences exist, which sounds very plain, but when we look into Marxist theories, or even like soziale Marktwirtschaft, which we have in German, like I don't even know how to translate that. It's like a non-thing that doesn't work, so maybe doesn't need to be translated. The social democratic approach of capitalism,
right?
Thing. Mixture. I don't know how to translate that. Whatever like principle we look in, they always see difference maybe as something that isn't there, that shouldn't be there, or something that we need to deal with because that's the right thing to do. But it's always like a very like unpleasurable way of dealing with it. And now we have the like counter movement with like difference. It's so great. It's so colorful and joyful, and
right.
Which sure, but we like. I would love that approach if we would take it to everything that just basically exists. So, but if we use it to mark it as just simply different in a negative way, that it like is a paradox in itself. Mm. So I think that's the first thing. Differences exist, point blank. No matter how we negotiate them, they still exist. No matter how much genocides you force on a nation, the differences still exist. You can't like get them out. So from that starting point of theory, I think that's often forgotten as a starting point. The question is, what do we do with this thing that will always exist? Mm-hmm. And I think the first thing is, on a very like practical level, what she teaches us, no matter what you do to difference, no matter in what sense, to destroy it, you will never destroy it. So just on a very practical level, it doesn't bring any benefit to try it. Because in this, like, for example, civil rights movement, they try to like low down the differences of like sexuality and gender and stuff. But that shortened the vision, that shortened the approach, that took people out and so on. So maybe first thing, differences exist. Second thing, can't destroy it, so don't try it. And maybe building up on that, those first like ground rules to approach difference is, okay, when we know it doesn't make sense to destroy it, why do we still want to do it? And I think that's where anger comes in at the theoretical point for it. That's where fear comes in. That's where love comes in. That's where colonialism comes in, and the separation of body and mind and spirit. And I think that's how she negotiated. It's like, why do we have this paradox of wanting to destroy something that is undestroyable in itself? I think that's a very like super interesting philosophical question, because that's very unreasonable way to behave for so different state actors and time periods, and it doesn't make sense, but everyone does it. So learning from that, I go to different discourses she has with different people of her time, and there is this like back and forth between her and Robert Staples. Have you read into it? Yeah, it's super interesting.
This is in the Black Scholar.
Yes.
Can you just say a little bit about the
sure,
context?
Of course, it's like a thread you start and you don't know. Like it's a messy chapter. I'm still working on how to explain it. Basically, there have been this theatre piece with this long title, "Colored Woman in a world like colored woman trying suicide in a world that ain't enough for them," or something like that. It's this long title. It's very. You will put it in the video. Everyone will see it.
Yes,
it's like 3 lines of title. It's very famous. You can watch it on YouTube. It's very, very great. And it's basically the first approach to address black machismo in the civil rights movement. And the writer of the theatre piece wrote about it also in the Black Scholar, and said that this creation of the black angry woman is based on the black macho. That's her theory. And that black nationalism is connected to black macho. That's what she later dumped, actually. But that's her first writing on it. And then Robert Staples answered to that as a black scholar and very angry man, that he, and I find it very confusing what he wrote, but how my best approach, my most loving approach is, yes, rape and sexual violence exist, but addressing that from a black woman perspective actually hurtful to the movement, because racism problem and capitalism. So it's not a good paper, to be honest. Very messy, and Audrey answers to that was sexism, an American disease, in blackface, and I found that helpful to not just negotiate the difference of gender, which is very obvious, but also experience, because for Robert Staples, it's like he can choose where he wants to see it and where not. He can choose which woman he wants to talk about and which not, while black women don't have that choice. And I think that's very interesting, that whenever we discuss difference under the umbrella of choice, we always can learn from Lord that this is already showing you being privileged. Because when you can't choose to see that difference, it's probably because you have less rights because of that difference. And often I think we mix-mash this truth of recognition of difference with actually being less than. So I don't think black women are less than black men, but the experience they make because of gender are drastically different from that of black men. That doesn't mean that black men don't also make experiences of gender that I can't completely understand.
Right.
Because of difference. But that none of this helps us to understand who is actually more than or less than. And that's where I try to understand law through a completely different approach, through Pateman and Mills, and their racial contract and gender contract theory, because that's a very like matrix idea. But actually what Lorde tells us, this only helps us to understand the relationship between nation or state, community and person. And what I bring in as a next layer is the super interpersonal and the self. So I try to broaden that. What I mean by that is the matrix helps us to understand how the state is treating black man versus black woman, or the community is treating black man versus black woman, rape, violence in relationships, and so on. But the very much interpersonal is how do I feel about it versus you? And then the super personal for me is what does this do to my life? So what do I mean by that? Maybe you have been born and labeled female, and you identified your whole life as a cis woman, as a black cis woman. That's your stick, that's your thing, you're feeling it. But maybe then one day you wear a suit. For whatever reason, you're not queer, just wear a suit. And you just have short hair on that day. And maybe the thing you experience is violence against trans bodies. So even though you never identified as trans, you still now share this experience. So how do we negotiate this very just in your body experience of difference? And I think we don't have an approach for that from the Vertragstheorie, like contract theory. And that's where I bring in Ansel Duda's Facultad. Because I think Facultad allows us to say, hey, I don't know how you feel about being trans and passports. I don't know how you feel about being trans and sexuality. But when you talk about street violence and being trans, I actually have Facultad because I experienced that. And that's kind of what is missing in a lot of discourses around difference and social contracts.
Wow. So this is the concept from Ansel Duda ends up being a way of articulating the thing that Lorde is identifying, where even across difference there are these sort of sites of bridging of experience and perspective
that don't help us to build identity. And I think when we look now, we always say, why did they identify as black women and those as black? You know, like we really want to ask, why are you in this box? Explain. But the truth is, I think it starts on a very smaller level of like, hey, it's weird, huh? Yeah, it's weird. And then you find more stuff around, and then you're like, oh, maybe queer could be a term, or like, or maybe it's like black butchness, even for non-queer. Like, you know what I mean? It's way messier than we want it to be. And that's how I try to negotiate difference in this chapter.
Thank you. That sounds great. So kind of building up from that, actually, I wanted to ask you a question about community, because that word, features sort of centrally in your own bio. And also, Lorde, I wanted to read you a quote from Lorde. I think the way that you were just using community there was sort of like potentially a site of violence, because there are kind of intra-communal sort of expectations and norms that can press in bad ways. But then on the other hand, through this Facultad that you're describing, there's a way of reconstituting community. And Lorde says, I think it's in the Master's Tools, she says, without community, there is no liberation, only the most vulnerable and temporary armistice between an individual and her oppression.
Yeah.
So how do you see community unfolding in Lorde's work also over the course of her life, through these Grenada, which was a community that she maybe was never quite a part of, and of course South Africa and Germany and of course St. Croix also, which isn't,
I think it's very different for different time periods and different communities. I think it's also funny because once I wrote in a German text about Audre Lorde and disability, I got the editor's note back. You actually have to change that phrasing because not everyone is part of communities. And I was like, oh no, that's wrong. Because community doesn't mean community of identity. Community just means being in community to each other based on completely different reasons. One can be identity, but can also be you share the same street and you do a street festival, and that's your community you're doing that with. So maybe just important that I address the US American concept of community, not the Dinglish version we're using here.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's clarifying.
Yeah, that's I think important distinction. And I think for Lorde, community for her and James Baldwin, I see them very deeply related in that, is that they have been part of communities, but always kind of on the periphery of it.
Mm-hmm.
And as poets, because of course you talk different to someone who writes about a community than someone who's just part of the community.
Mm.
But also as they never experienced a community that was absolutely the same in every, at least, identity point they have. And I deeply relate to that as something that is not bad, but something that helps to negotiate how I write. So that's actually what I learned from her and from her writings, that it's not a bad thing, this outsider perspective inside.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also something that is deeply like changing your experience of community, because it's not this like place to like lay down everything and just be yourself and relate in every like angle of your being. I always explain that with a very real example, but I think that's what a lot of white men experience when they go to Berliner Eckkneipen, those like corner pubs we have here that are very famous, because they go there and everyone shares their interest. They have the same like favorite football man thing. They have the same, at least shown off sexuality. And if you go into different Berliner Eckkneipen, I will say that right term because it's so specific, different pubs, you see that the crowd is very different from pub to pub. So there's this one pub in Schöneberg where only former criminals go to. And they very openly talk about how it was in jail and how they negotiate that. And once I entered and a guy just told me he murdered his wife once. And I was like, what the fuck? But then I realized, oh, that's a community. Yeah. And I didn't have a crime story, so I was a weird one. Everyone was like, oh, so no break in your life, huh? Just like doing your thing. And I was a weird one.
Wow.
So I think when we talk about community, it's always about a set of rules bound to a space or to a purpose. And that's how I would phrase it very, very broadly. And I think some people experience, at least for some time, just like oozing into it, feeling absolute relief, feeling absolutely sameness. Not forced sameness as long as but absolutely sameness. And I think that's a very healing experience. But there's a lot of grief in it if you can never experience that. But, and that's maybe the huge thing, James Baldwin as well as Audre Lorde, they then choose travel to come into absolute difference, to then find the sameness with their communities back home. So when Audre Lorde went, for example, to Russia, she reports on how weird it is to experience healthcare as a US American. And it was like, that's really something we all experience. That's a community, that's not a great community, but it's a community of people being absolutely feared by the littlest injury because of the healthcare system. So I think like this forcing yourself into like totally difference, being the most different person somewhere, can help you to understand, oh, actually there is some sameness back there. And I think when we look onto Grenada, that's what she experienced. She was born as one of the first like migrant families who came from Grenada to the US in a community that was black, but not Grenadinian, not even Caribbean mainly. So they were kind of a little bit the odd one out, and they had to like blend into this like US American racial system instead of their racial system. And then later with the like invasion, she realized that her understanding of the situation was so different from the other US people, but also her relation was different than those of Grenadinians or Caribbean people who are living there. So I think that's kind of what community does. It gives you a home. It gives you something to see yourself in, but seeing yourself in also means, for her at least, seeing how different you are. So I think, bringing this back to the Poetry is Not Luxury text, these last words are sometimes read as like empowerment and just joyful. And I always try to point out that, no, this is like a commitment. She's like, community is pain for me, but I still understand I need that.
Yeah.
It's not like community is great for me all the time. And it also happens to be helpful. But more like community is the starting ground to change. Change yourself, change society, change the environment, whatever layer you want to focus on.
So one thing that I've thought about in relation to that is how I wonder, and I have theories about this, but there's some contrast with, for example, Patricia Hill Collins' account of safe spaces, or Bell Hooks talking about home place, like as the place where you can check your flaps. You know, like I think she's talking about a truck that you know, stuff gets stuck in the flaps on the highway, and they have to make sure that their wheels are going to work properly. And for Lorde, I feel like there isn't this sense that there's this kind of retreat into a community, because community is so shot through with difference. So I mean, in relation to the incomplete visions, like there's no complete vision, right, available. So how does that just mean keep working at it, or is there, you know, what do we take from that?
I think for me this is a very like deeper Caribbean discourse actually. There is, I would challenge Collins, I would challenge Bell Hooks, that's right, I'm right on them, that's why I write on Audre Lorde, because I deeply feel that this Afroflash, it's called by Seske, actually referring to the German Bundestreffen of the German community. So this Afroflash is the incomplete vision. It's kind of like entering your first romantic relationship and you're like, this is the perfect person. They are just amazing. All the things they're doing are amazing. Did I thought cars are boring? Yes, but now I love cars. Always have been my thing. They have like the greatest taste in food. Their humor is hilarious, you know? But as older you get, as like more often you start relationships, you realize like, oh, actually everyone is a person. And it's best to like feel the love, like feel the connection, but also, wow, this person is like calling a lot, and maybe boundaries would be a good thing from the start, because I learned that from my past relationships. So I feel like sometimes we don't want to learn those like relationship lessons for community. And hence that's why what Lorde addresses here. This like, yes, community important and beautiful, but also like, let's stay clever about it. And learn our lessons from it, because I think that's the incomplete vision for communities in a broader sense. Does it have to be that space where everyone feels just sameness and there's no conflict and everyone can heal? And this is putting a lot on communities too. Like if we all go there without like proper access to healthcare, without like proper income, without having like a birth family or chosen family that's there for us, and then we ask community to do all those layers, like I told, like the state, the community, the interpersonal, the personal, like when we have those different layers, but we put that all on community, it's too much. It can't bring you that, but community can bring you things. It can be the right place to structure your activism. It can be the right space to challenge your ideas and find new ideas, or be like, oh, that's something I didn't know and now I know better. And those are great things, but we kind of forget about them if we push this like healing space narrative on it. And it also is a strong argument against any kind of negotiation of difference inside of communities, because then you're the person who brings in the trouble, brings in the drama. So I think it's actually the reason why my first text on Audre Lorde was on the Bundestreffen, was on community, because I think we can build actually like stronger and more helpful communities if we from the starting point on address Audre Lorde's theories and understand that difference will be inherent, because we are different people. We are even sometimes different in ourselves. And that's actually a thing that is just there. Sometimes will be great, sometimes will be super stressful, but we have to, from the starting point on, find out how to negotiate that. And maybe my final note on that is actually the amazing book Unapologetic. I don't know if you read it.
I haven't read it.
It's on Black activism in the US and like lessons I learned. And I find it super helpful to read this book, because they like very openly talk about stress they had in building communities. And what I learned from Unapologetic is exactly the title of the book, like to be unapologetic yourself when entering communities, and also whatever the community tells you about themselves, believe them, like believe them early and quickly. And I think that's why Lorde wrote so many like letters and texts and essays on her experiences in communities, because there was no like talking ground for that.
Thank you. So this is a very open-ended final question,
Cool.
because there may be things that you haven't talked about yet that you really want to talk about. But I wanted to ask if there are any other kind of stories or moments from Lord's life that really kind of stick with you while you're doing your work, you know, that where you sort of see this thing happening in her life and it just keeps coming back.
Yeah, definitely. It's maybe like one of the two things that are very unglorious. I try to challenge a lot of the hero narrative we have around Audre Lorde, because I think it doesn't help us to really read her and understand her. We always look into like, where's the great part? What can I quote? And there are like two like moments that I find interesting. The one is more broader. I will start with that because it's just funny, because I read so many of her correspondence and mostly from her archive, so it's mostly the letters that were sent to her.
Oh, right.
And almost all of them, like a lot of them start with like, why don't you answer? You're very slow at answering. I always tell you so much about myself, but you don't like. It's a lot of that.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, I found that encouraging too. And when she had relationships, it was a lot of time like, yeah, your like wife or like woman answered me, but I actually would like to talk to you. So I think she was like a very, even though she was poly, even though she lived like in different relationships at the same time, she really like had her like primary partner thing going on strongly. And I found that so funny that the letters towards her really much read like letters towards like big white men who think in their like Elfenbeinturm, you know, like having big thoughts while the wifey is writing correspondence. So very much matching the identity there. And then the other thing that I found very interesting are the letters back and forth through the Off Our Backs magazine between her and June Jordan and some other actors of that time. I don't want to list and name them all, and I have all the correspondence that was not printed also in the magazine. And I think what's so challenging and interesting about that, it's part of my difference chapter, is that there she's really taking a role back. So she's not the like primary actor, she's just signing letters off and is kind of in the mix of it, but also her name is already really big, and it's very like non-Lordy, you could say, because normally you see that like she's a big actor and she's doing this big speech, and there she's like more like should do this, should do that. It's very wobbly and unclear what her positionality is on that. And I find that so interesting to read that in contrast to the early letters between June and Audre that were very loving and caring and supporting and radical, and how much Lorde's like tone shifted from person to person. Like when she wrote with June, she was very like bland and angry and like very like how June sounds in letters. Like June Jordan was very like, I hate this and very funny also. With Pat Parker, they have this like long back and forth of letters that are very like love-filled and relationship advice and political and very like focused on the practicality of working as poets. And yeah, I found that like deeply intriguing to see those different sides of her. And to be honest, I very much prefer my picture of her that I have now than beforehand as like big untouchable thinker. And I'm like, no, that was like a real life person.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing all of these kinds of pieces of this tapestry that you're putting together with the dissertation.
Thank you so much for the questions.
Yeah, and I'm excited to see the work kind of filter out into the public, you know, not just the Uni Erfurt sort of, you know, not just this document that has an audience of, you know, a committee, but I feel like all of us who are reading Lorde's work are going to profit so much from your insight. So thank you.
Thank you so much for the interview. I'm also looking forward to reading Kam's book and your book. Yeah.
Thank you. Great.
Cool.